Welcome, everyone, to the June 2021 Bible and Beyond Bible Textual Studies discussion. I am your host, Shirley Paulson, and Dr. Hal Taussig and I are your presenters for this evening. In this study, we'll be talking about violence in the letter of Peter to Philip. We think this text is one of the most eloquent Christ-related treatments of intense Roman imperial violence. Our study will look at the program put together by the post-resurrection, light-filled, and disembodied Jesus Christ and his very embodied and threatened team of ambassadors. I also want to mention that you can now make an ongoing pledge of support for everything going on with the Early Christian Texts website, including this Bible and Beyond discussion via Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to make a pledge that's just right for you. You can also make a one-off donation using PayPal or a check if you prefer. Check the chat box here or the website for details. Thank you so much. Really appreciated it. Hal, it's all yours. Take it away.
This letter of Peter to Philip is probably the most powerful document in relationship to Roman imperial violence that exists. It's interesting. We'll see how much Rome's imperial violence did damage and to all kinds of people in the early Mediterranean, but especially, or not especially, but among them, the many Jesus and Christ people of that time. So we're eager also to be co-hosts tonight in a particular way. I'll start us off and then Shirley will jump in. As usual, we will be, depending on your own thoughts, questions, and protests about this text, and looking forward to diving in to claim this text in additional ways. I think I'm just going to mostly, for our first few minutes, say just a little bit about this text, and then read a fair amount from it. Mainly, we think that this text was written sometime in the 2nd century, and that would be then before Christianity itself existed. But while there were many other kinds of Jesus and Christ people thinking, developing communities, and also taking a lot of risks in who they were in the ancient Mediterranean. So again, first to just underline that one of the main facts of life in the first 2 centuries of the Mediterranean was the violence of the Roman Empire. And so what we see in the letter of Peter to Philip is probably the most direct address to what to do with the fact that the Roman Empire was crucifying hundreds, thousands of people, that it was basically enslaving hundreds of thousands of people. Military conquests were being directed from the Roman Empire towards all kinds of nations in the Mediterranean. So the letter of Peter to Philip, I'm just going to read you some quotes from about this. So here's a prayer from the letter of Peter to Philip. Child of life, child of deathlessness, who dwells in the light, the child, the Christ of deathlessness, our rescuer, give us your power, for they seek to kill us. Or again, in chapter 6, the ambassadors worshipped again, saying, Lord, tell us how shall we fight against the rulers, since they are over us. Then a voice called from the appearance, saying, you all will fight against them in this way. The rulers fight against the inner part of humans, but you will fight against them in this way. Come together and teach salvation to the world with a promise. Strengthen yourself with the power of my Father and offer your prayers. The Father will help you as he helped you by sending me. Do not be afraid. I am with you forever. As I said to you before, when I was in the body. Then lightning and thunder came from the heavens, and what appeared to them was carried off up to the heavens. The ambassadors gave thanks to the Lord with every blessing and returned to Jerusalem. While they were going there, they spoke with each other on the road about the light which came. A conversation occurred concerning the Lord. They said, if he, our Lord, suffered, how much will we suffer? Peter responded and said, he suffered for our sake, and it is necessary that we must too also suffer because of our smallness. Then a voice came to them, saying, I have told you all many times that it is necessary for you to suffer. It is necessary that you be brought to synagogues and governors so that you will suffer. But those who will not suffer will not save their lives. So there's some more of this, but you get the sense that the main problem with life in these days among this group called the ambassadors, by the way, this is often translated the apostles, but that's, from my point of view, a bad translation. We need to have a real translation in English. So these were people who basically, in the Mediterranean, saw themselves as ambassadors going around to different groups to talk and to represent God and the God of Israel. So what the key thing that happens in the letter of Peter to Philip is that these ambassadors who are frightened to death because Jesus was killed, they're pretty sure they're going to be killed. They know other people have been killed and tortured. So these ambassadors basically grab hold of their own courage and basically find themselves to be ambassadors in public against the violence of Rome. I'll just leave this there for a moment and ask Shirley for you to jump in.
Oh, good. This text, it's fun that Hal and I have been able to share this text because, first of all, we both strongly agree that this is such an important text as it's dealing with this very serious and important subject of violence. We also look at it a little bit differently in terms of how we interpret it. So I think the fun part about that is that it kind of invites you to think about what it means to you, which is the fun part of having this discussion. Don't you agree with that, Hal? It's been fun. So yes. One of the things that I am very drawn to with this text is that because it's dealing with violence and the extreme force of violence against humanity, I think there's a message in here about saving and helping and healing that's rather stunning. Instead of Jesus becoming the power of salvation, he ends up giving authority to his ambassadors or the apostles or disciples or whatever you want to call them. And that's kind of unusual when you compare it to the biblical text you might be more familiar with, where it seems like Jesus is doing all the wonder works and the ambassadors or the disciples are learning. But here, the whole book is about, or the whole letter here is about giving them the strength and the authority to go out and do this healing work. The term that's used here is light giving, which I love. It's like the violence they're dealing with is a horrible, frightening and terrible darkness in the world. But Jesus is a light giver, and he's giving his ambassadors the power to become light givers themselves. So, for example, he says when they're troubled and they're praying and they're asking for help, they ask him directly, how do we have the authority of freedom? And why do the powers fight against us? And in his response, he tells them a few things to do that Hal has already mentioned. One of them is to strip yourselves of what is corrupt to become light givers. And I think what's interesting there is that it seems like he's giving them the place to do something themselves. Like, in other words, Jesus is not performing an act of magic or some kind of power on them. He's giving them something to find within themselves. So stripping yourself of something that's corrupt, I might even ask you what you think that might be. I mean, there are lots of ways of interpreting that, but let's just stop a minute and see what you think. What do you think that this passage is asking for when Jesus is saying, strip yourselves of what is corrupt to become a light giver? Any thoughts about that? By the way, I can't see hands very well on this, so if you would unmute yourself just to speak, that'll help, because I can't see who's raising hands.
Well, all right, okay, I'll offer something. I think to strip yourself of being afraid, because fear is corrupted. It stops you from expressing the Christ that you're supposed to do if you're.
That's a very helpful thought. Yeah. It is corrupting. Yeah. I think of corrupting almost sounds like it's a moral issue, and doesn't come across as a moral problem that they're dealing with. It has maybe something to do that would weaken their abilities or their powers. Yeah. Any more thoughts about this?
Yeah, to me, the whole idea of corruption is replacing the light of God with the dictates of the self. It's saying it badly. It's taking power in sort of an earthly way to bend creation to your own will, as opposed to allowing God's power to flow through you into creation. And so I think it's a better way of putting it, what I see as corruption. It's like a damning of the power of God.
Very interesting, right. I like the way you're talking about the almost changing from your will of creation to the will of the divine power. And that comes across in the text too, because there's a passage that talks about how when Jesus is explaining to them what's going on, he describes the basic problem as willfulness on the part of the self-willed, arrogant, demi creator, whatever that is. And so we ought to stop and talk about that a little bit. Or Hal, do you want to jump in and keep going with the story, or should we talk about that part?
I was just wondering, Shirley, if you had made such an important observation in our work together, and even already tonight, by noticing that the Jesus figure is in this text is disembodied,
yeah,
and simply light. And then you contrast, I think, very helpfully that that this text really is not demanding in a primary way for Jesus to do something, but for the apostles or the ambassadors to do something. Can you say more about the curiosity and the importance or the difficulty in having a Jesus that is not bodily?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point about this particular text, because much of the New Testament, of course, in the Gospels, we have Jesus doing all these things. The Acts of the Apostles is more about the acts of what they're doing. And Jesus is there, but not quite as much as it is in this text. In this text, there's a real conversation. And Jesus says, I think 2 or 3 times in this text, don't be afraid, I'm with you. I'm with you. And yet his body wasn't there. So there's a wonderful way of thinking, well, what does it mean then when I'm with you, but my body's not here? And at the same time, he's empowering them. He's not a distant voice saying, I hope you remember to obey me. It's like he's right there, comforting and guiding. And I think it's interesting to hear that you use the term the curiosity. And it's interesting to me that after they pray and Jesus appears in this light, they ask him a lot of questions, which is, kind of an interesting response to violence. If you're feeling threatened with your life, do you start asking God about what are these powers and how do you give us light? They have some kind of connection here, I think, in their relationship, where they're wanting to learn from Jesus what it is that empowers them to act in a different way. So I think we should talk a little again more about that empowerment. We talked a little bit about the removing the corruption, but he gives them light to become light givers, illuminators. That's another term, a translation for that. And so there are a couple of steps that he provides for them. He tells them, come together and teach, as Hal read to us. Teach salvation in the world with a promise. Strengthen yourselves with the power of my Father and your prayers, and don't be afraid. So let's talk a little bit about what does it mean to come together. The letter of Peter to Philip is Peter is saying to Philip, please come and join us, because Philip had disconnected himself from the fellow ambassadors. So he calls them together. And then Philip comes, and then their specific instructions are come together. And I think it'd be kind of interesting to talk a little bit about why do you think that's important in the midst of violence? Any thoughts on that? While you're thinking about that, I might suggest that there are many forms of religion today where the suggestion is to do things all by yourself. Like you work out your salvation alone with God, or you enter the closet to pray, as Jesus tells us to do. But in this case, he's saying, come together. And I find that there might be a kind of a reluctance to think, why should I come together if I'm trying to save myself? Anybody have some thoughts about that?
Well, it seems to me that there could be strength in numbers, that they could support each other and give each other courage. So I think that would be a way, an idea of coming together.
And do you see any reasons for why that would be helpful in terms of, you've mentioned courage. Does it help with actually dealing with the violence itself? Or do you think courage is enough? Kind of a hard question, maybe, but I'm just
That's a hard question, Shirley.
I'm just asking because it's so important in the text. I mean, the letter of Peter to Philip is about coming together, and then he specifically gives instructions, come together. And so I think
since this is Pride Month, and speaking as a member of the LGBTQ community,
okay,
coming together is a very important aspect. It's forming community for mutual support. And I think we've seen this with any group that's oppressed, is that being able to come together, being able to gather is a form of resistance to the oppressive forces, the violence that's used against them. And it's not just a matter of mutuality of courage. I mean, there's all these side effects that you get from it, but it's really the statement of we're here. It's the statement of being present. And I think that's where the power comes in. In essence, it's saying, I have light and we have light, and then being able to proclaim that light as a group.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because it does seem to me that you're right. The Roman oppression had to do with our group versus your group. It wasn't just going after individuals and saying, I don't like you, I don't like you, but the group of domination was acting itself out by oppressing other groups. So by coming together, there's a statement of identity in a group. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Well, I think it could be too an idea of being obedient, because they ask them to come together. Okay, you've come together. So that's another thought.
Yeah.
Plus, expressing love for one another. And I think that makes a big difference. I've seen it was a biography on PBS on Tina Turner, who's a singer that I've always liked a lot. And it was about her childhood. And basically, she was abandoned by her parents as a young child. And it was the church that saved her, that gave her expression and allowed her to develop her talent as a singer. And they were the ones who supported her and kept her going. And I think that's a lot of it, is that maybe on our own, we may be strong, but we're not strong across the board. We may be strong this way, but not another way. But you get together with somebody who's strong where you're weak, and you can encourage them where they're weak. And I think that's the concept. Yeah,
very, very interesting. Yeah. I'm so glad we asked the question, because you have such different ways of seeing it. It helps all of us to think.
I think Stephanie, Reverend Stephanie, was ready to say something.
Oh, good. Stephanie?
Yeah, I was going to say that you have to look at the danger of being ambassadors but being on separate sides. And I think that's the importance of the coming together. And I can't help but think of January 6th as I read this text. Because if we are ambassadors of the light, but yet we're on different sides, right? And so Jesus comes to tell them to come together, because there's danger in separation. And I think that's why he talks about the suffering. And if you're afraid to suffer, if you feel you don't have to suffer, then do you really have the light? And so I think we have to look at the dangers of separation that Jesus is kind of leading to in the text.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Stephanie. Would you like to, or maybe Hal, say something more about the relationship of suffering? I mean, yes, being willing to suffer. That was an interesting topic that comes up in this text when Peter is talking to his fellow ambassadors and saying, Jesus suffered, but we have to suffer. If we don't suffer, we're not going to experience the full salvation. But it's a different kind of in other words, there was a difference between what they were being asked to do and what Jesus did. Their persecution was not the same. So maybe Hal, do you want to talk a little bit about that, or Stephanie, either one of you?
I think that the suffering comes when you have to take a stance for humanity, right? You have to take a stance for righteousness. And if you live amongst inhumane power structures, and if you live amongst oppression, and you are an ambassador of the light, you have to be willing to deal with the suffering that comes with standing up for righteousness, right? So again, we go back to January 6th, right? So if you put patriotism over the gospel and over righteousness, then do you really have the light? That's the question. Do you really have the light? Are you really an ambassador of the light if you would rather be more patriotic than to stand up for the folk who are oppressed, than to stand up and have laws that would keep LGBTQ out of danger, that would keep Black Lives Matter out of danger, that would not oppress women's reproductive system. And so these are, the suffering that comes with it is that you have to recognize that you're always going to be an outsider from empire and from the powers that be. And if you're not willing to do that, it's not like you're asking you to get on a cross, but you got to say, I'm not going to participate in systems of oppression. And so I think that's part of the suffering. Of course, violence does come with it, can come with it too. I want to say that too. Violence can come with it, right? And we know that within the trans community, right? We know that in the Black community with police. We know that with the Palestinians in Israel. We know that, right? And so, but is it the same suffering that Jesus was under for the ambassadors? I'm not so sure.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I think you've really hit the heart of, for me, what is so important about this text, and that is that it is really one of the most obvious of all the texts of the early Christ people that is very similar to so much of what we experience today. There's so much violence in our world against so many different peoples that we finally have got a text that actually has its main object to stand up against violence, and especially what Anita said, that this is a way of active resistance against thorough violence. And for me, it's just a great find. I should say just at that point that I think in terms of scholars that have begun to work on this, there's clearly one scholar in our time that has done more to bring this anti-violence text to bear, and that's Professor Karen King at Harvard. She is the one, more or less single-handedly, that has said, hey, look at this.
And how grateful we are for her to bring it to our attention. I think I've read this, but it wasn't until we read it slowly and carefully with some of the insights that you've shared that it made me realize how powerful this text is. So I'd like to also raise the question, it's interesting that Jesus is there helping them to deal with the courageously and with authority against the violence and to stand up for themselves. But I think it's intriguing too that they end up going into the temple and healing a crowd. Twice that's mentioned in this text, that they end up healing. And, you'd think, okay, I've got other things on my mind than going to heal other people. So I'd like your thoughts on that too. Do you see any kind of connection between, first of all, why they would be healing? And then we'll talk a little bit about how they might have healed. But any thoughts first on why would healing be associated with confronting the violence that they're dealing with?
Because hurt people hurt people. I think if you're really going to do the work to confront violence, you first have to heal what the violence has done to you, right? And so if you go out there without the healing, then what leads you? Does the light lead you, or does your anger lead you? Wow. Does the light lead you, or does your fear lead you? And so healing is very important because you can't really help people to be strong without the healing, you know. And so I think it goes hand in hand. It goes hand in hand.
Yeah. Well, I love the way you're bringing out that healing is about strengthening ourselves, and that wherever we find our own weaknesses, whether it's being hurt or being violated in some way, or being even physically sick, whatever the hurt is, when we find that healing, we have something powerful to give to somebody else. And we have to. We can't keep it to ourselves.
Right. You saw that in the civil rights movement, right? That Dr. King always was in church, right? Before the people marched, before the people went out to face the oppressors, to face the violence, they prayed, they worshiped. And so it was a form of healing your soul, healing your spirit that gave you strength to keep on going.
And that's kind of different from, please help me and do your magic for me. It's rather strengthen me so that I can do something for others.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Very powerful. Any more thoughts on the connection between violence and healing others?
What comes to mind for me is violence only works if it invokes fear.
Mm.
And so to all of a sudden focus on healing, that's the opposite of invoking fear. And so in essence, it undermines whatever power violence has. And so it becomes a way really of completely changing the conversation, the dynamics, the framing, however you want to put it, in whatever social context that you were raised in. But it really is just it's saying no. That's not what's real. This is what's real. That the healing is real, and it's in that healing. It's again sort of that openness, that bringing forth the light that healing does. Anybody who's gone through some healing, there's a real sense of light re-entering your world as you heal, and so I love this connection between light and as really the way of dealing with the threat of violence. It's like, no, I'm going to bring the light into the world, and I can't control what they do, but what they do doesn't have any power over me.
That's kind of awesome, I think, what you just said. To think that when they're facing crucifixion, which sounds pretty powerful, to say you have no power over me is a phenomenal thing to say. Because, as you've mentioned, that the suffering certainly is, you take on these things, all the violence against you, but for you to be able to say, you have no power over me, I think that's what Jesus must be saying when he's giving them authority in the face of violence. And instead of running away, or instead of Jesus doing some magic trick for them, they are strengthened to act on that power, that authority. It's awesome. Well, I like asking these questions because I'm hearing new things that are wonderful to hear. Any more thoughts about that?
Well, I just going to say that when I was a teenager, I heard Reverend Martin Luther King give a talk in Detroit. And the statement, or the message that he gave was extremely important to me, because he pointed out that when Jesus was saying, Father, forgive them, but they know not what they do, he was in the midst of the crucifixion. It wasn't before the crucifixion or after the crucifixion. It was during crucifixion. And I always remember that, because that was like, it was a real powerful, because that's where, these individuals are saying that it's why you're going through it, and to forgive and express joy and expectation of victory, I think is a powerful message to all.
Wow. So you're bringing up another subject that comes through this text, and that is the subject of salvation itself. because part of their instruction is to go out and teach salvation in the world with a promise, which is an interesting phrase. Let's talk a little bit about salvation. Remember that this was, as Hal pointed out to us, this was written before there was a Christian church who set up doctrinal rules about what salvation meant. So we're talking about salvation in the early years when it meant more like saving you or rescuing you from danger, or even disease or illness or any kind of suffering. It had more to do with kind of a present tense rather than what happens after you die, even though that's probably included. But let's talk a little bit about what you think. Why would that be part of their instructions in the face of the violence to go teach salvation in the world with a promise? What do you think that means? Teach salvation in the world with a promise.
I think we could go back to Dr. King again.
Okay.
James Cone and I used to, we had a little back and forth with this. He talked about Jesus on the cross, and that people had to recognize the crosses that they were on, and not focus so much on salvation. But my stance was, you can't have people face hoses and dogs without some of that salvation power, right? You can't have people be spit upon and beat and not retaliate unless they had some salvation power, right? And so the promise of salvation is, no matter what happens to you, right, you will never, ever lose the light. You will never, ever be lightless. Wow. And so if you face the dogs, if you face the violence, if you stand up for what is right, when I used to teach in the church, I was like, salvation is a win-win. So because it's a win-win, we should just do what's right. if we do what's right and we win, that's a win. If we do what's right and they kill us, we go to heaven. It's a win. We're never lightless. So why are we acting afraid to do what's right? So I think salvation was a mindset that there is nothing that can separate you from the light. So walk in it, because it will always be yours. So I think that's the importance of the salvation.
That's very interesting. So salvation is the light itself. And I like the way you're talking about the light never, never, never leaves you. That's a really beautiful way of saying that salvation has nothing to do with after death getting a judgment, but rather there's a light that has nothing to do with whether your human body is this way or that way. It's a permanent kind of thing. So what do you think that promise is? The salvation in the world with a promise. What's that promise?
Well, from my point of view, I would want to say that this text is derivative of the people of Israel. And if you look at what in the Bible the people of Israel say about what salvation is, it's when somebody's coming to kill you and destroy your land. That is not an ethereal thing for Israel. It's because so many other countries come after them, not because they're Israel, but just because they're tiny. But for me, salvation is taking really seriously real violence and resisting it, as Anita said, as actively as possible. It seems to me that, from my point of view, Christian teachings about salvation with a promise so quickly go to the afterlife.
Yeah.
And this is a text that doesn't even know that kind of Christianity. For that a follower Jesus says this in this way, saying, it's 4 times in the text it says, they're after us, they're going to kill us. And Jesus says, go out to the temple and stand up and make sure that doesn't happen as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Hal. It's just so interesting to hear about the real visceral way of the way this affected them in that time. Can you say just a little bit more about the people of Israel being, you pointed out that they weren't being attacked just because they were Israel, but they were being attacked because they were small?
Yeah, this is the time in the Mediterranean and Near East, when you have the era of the empires coming into existence. So the very powerful multinational powers are just eating up the smaller peoples. And Israel is just a small people. So their model for salvation is, leave us alone, let us be real people, and don't kill us. And sometimes Israel will blame itself because its strategy of resistance wasn't clever enough or strong enough.
So it's interesting that you're bringing out the smallness in relation to what both Anita and Stephanie have said in terms of the smallness of their own communities that they're talking about, and the need to stand up to be strong in the face of a larger community.
Yeah, so, you even find in this text it says it's our smallness that's at the heart of the suffering we're having.
Right. So there is a perplexing part of this text that Hal and I have spent hours talking about, and I don't think we have any conclusions yet. And I'm only going to bring it to your attention just because if you're reading the text, I don't want you to get stuck there and think this doesn't make any sense and throw it away. Now, you may want to do that, but I would like to just bring a little bit of thought to it. It's the section kind of in the middle where they ask Jesus to explain the lack, or another translation for the lack is a deficiency. And then, so Jesus explains a little bit where the deficiency comes from, and then how that's contrasted with the fullness. Well, the lack or the deficiency and the fullness are terms that are used fairly often in other extra canonical texts. We run across them, especially fullness. We see that even in the canonical texts. But he's explaining the fullness, the way I look at it anyway, the deficiency as the explanation for the mess that they're in, why things are going wrong. Like, it's not because they're being bad or they're morally wrong, it's because there's something bigger that's going on that's causing all the problem. And in that context, he says, well, it's because the mother disagreed with the father and she created a mess. And so that's kind of hard to take for those of us who feel like women shouldn't be put down like that. And that's one of the reasons we would like to just dismiss that text. But I have just one idea to throw out there, and we can just discuss it a little bit. But it seems to me, it kind of reminds me of maybe the text in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is talking with Nicodemus and telling him you should be born again or born from above, because being born of the mother or being born of the flesh is a problem. So he's saying, how do you get born again? Yeah. And so he's sort of bringing out a little bit there, a difference in mothers, that there's a mother that makes you suffering mortal, and there's another mother that is your real mother, the mother that is the mother of right living, or the life that you really are. Now, I don't want to make it sound like it's going off into an ethereal heavenly place that's only for spiritual, nomads or something like that. But I think it has to do with discerning the difference between the light and the darkness, because Jesus is saying to them there. They ask, explain it to us what this is, and he says, I'm paraphrasing, of course, that this dark area comes from this source, that there's something wrong with the cause of the problem, the source of the problem. And the solution is, in the fullness, this is when Jesus is sent down to be among the mortals and say, I've got another way of looking at things. Listen to me and follow me. Wake up and find your true origin. And that, to me, the contrast between the deficiency and the fullness. Now, there are lots of ways of interpreting this. Hal might say, let's just skip the whole thing, but maybe Hal, you can speak for yourself. What would you say about that?
Thanks for raising this difficult question, Shirley, because introducing a powerful text can be problematic if we don't also raise questions. For me, this is clearly a part of the larger failure of the early Christ people, who sometimes, some of the groups, blamed women's leadership. And this is, I can't read this any other way than the only two times that women are mentioned in this text, it's as the negative people, the negatives who won't obey the Father.
Yeah.
So I just think that's garbage.
Yeah. So as you can see,
I want to say, when I read it, I immediately thought of Origins of the World and the Secret Revelation of John, because it sounds like they're talking about Sophia and the both. That's what it sounds like to me. Yeah. And I think that we have to help people connect the dots, that this story is just, like you say, how it is blaming of women, that's sexist, but you have to see where it comes from, right? And so, because people could look at this and not realize that the text could possibly be talking about believing in a false God, right? Believing in a God that doesn't really truly have the light. And so you got to help folks, because I think it's important to connect those texts there to see that the light comes, right? When you're truly focusing on connecting and community, as those two texts were pushing forth with their story. So when I read it, that's what I immediately thought of. And I thought of, how can I do this in my own writing, show the connection, show the importance of when your gods or your leaders start becoming individualistic, then you have problems. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I thank you for bringing that up, Stephanie, because actually because I'm very familiar also with the Secret Revelation of John. That stood out to me too, that this current text, this letter to Peter to Philip, is kind of like an abbreviated form of that bigger story. But it's also true that I don't think we want to necessarily say it is exactly that story, because there's so many other texts that tell it slightly differently, and it goes this way and it goes that way, and they have different interpretations. And so even though I make the connection that you're making, I think we have to also be careful that we're not assuming that's exactly the same story. So there are different reasons to it. But what I do see in there is that story talks about the creation of bad things in a way that is similar to this way. And I don't think of it as women people. I think of it as the symbol of mothering in the false way. So but it does. I agree with Hal too, that it does not bring out the power of women the way the Secret Revelation of John does, for example.
And that's why I was saying, if we could get the connection, because this story is bigger than that, right? Yeah. That there's so much more to the women in those other books. And you just take a little, I appreciate someone once sound bites are not holy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so you take sound bites and snippets from other texts, and it loses its meaning if you don't have people connect the dots. But I do understand what you mean. You know, you don't want to say concretely this came from this,
Yeah.
but you want to help people imagine, you know, open their minds a little bit, you know.
I suppose it's a little bit like our reading of the Gospels in the canon, and that they're not saying the same thing,
Right.
but there's a connection there. They're talking about Jesus and Mary in different ways. So, but it's a connection that we should probably understand. So, it certainly does inspire us to keep reading more text, though, because the more you read, the more you realize, oh, wait, this does add a little bit of light to that. So maybe that helps you to get that picture.
Right.
I have something about another text, that the Gospel of Thomas, and it's saying 101. Jesus said, "Whosoever does not hate her mother and her father in the same way I do, cannot be a follower of mine. And whosoever does not love her father and her mother in the same way I do, cannot be a follower of mine. For my mother birthed my body, but my true mother gave me life." And I thought that it's the difference, a false concept of womanhood versus the true concept of womanhood, the true concept of a mother.
Yeah, and he's using the term true and false there. So you're right. Yeah. And I thank you so much for bringing that up. That's a very wonderful example of Stephanie's point that these other texts help illuminate in a way. They may not be specifically referring one to the other, but it is a helpful way to understand this. That it's useful. That there's a difference between a sense of mother that Jesus is getting at. Learn the difference. It's
right, because when I read 101, Gospel of Thomas, I think of Barbello, right? And so, you know, that's why it's important to read the text. So, like you said, but to keep reading, because it'll help you grow your mind, you know?
Well, you are great salespeople for this a New Testament, and for just reading all these texts, because you're right, it's a richer conversation when you get more involved in them like that. Great. All right, so Hal, let's go back to you. Do you have some maybe concluding remarks on all this whole text?
Well, I appreciate that you were bringing up the really the final scene in this text is one of healing, and especially what Anita said relative to that seems so important about the character of healing in resistance. But one of the things I love most about this text is that it doesn't guarantee success. I mean, it puts the people, it puts the ambassadors out there in a resistance posture for work in the world, but it has Jesus very clearly, the disembodied Jesus, saying, "Hey, I'm going to be with you all the time." But it does not. It is not a triumphant text. It's a courageous text and a healing text. But in most of the early Christ people, even as they heal, they don't experience healing as a complete triumph. So this is such a powerful way for us in our day to step forward into goodness without saying we're always the winner.
And you know, I might from my perspective on that, is that it probably is a way of saying we can't expect to find everything about Jesus's promises here and now, because the crucifixions kept on going after Jesus. The crucifixions kept on going even after the ambassadors. So things kept on going. There still has been violence, but there's a way to deal with it. It's what I find in this text. you say that it's not a triumphal message, which I agree with, but it is true that it says that they went out in the power of Jesus in peace, which is, they found, to me, it's what it's saying, they found their inner peace and they could deal with it courageously. So whether that's triumphal or not, they found something inside that is worthy of celebrating, I think.
Yeah, and it's goodness and it's healing.
Yeah. Well, so are there any other thoughts about this text before we talk about next month? Any questions or observations anybody wants to make?
Yeah, there's some things that are bothering anybody about this introduction of this text. Well, I can say a little bit about our July meeting, the fourth Monday of July, and it's the 25th in the evening. We're going also here to look again at a couple of texts that we've done over a year ago, and I'm calling it called Eve. It's a focus on Eve and Noria, two powerful female figures in the first 2 centuries in the new texts that are being discovered. So there, Eve is mostly a salvific figure that helps all of humanity. And her daughter, Noria, is even stronger as a courageous and salvific, salvation giving, and that's in the old way of salvation. So we're going to look at texts of Noria and Eve, who are lively figures for a bunch of early Christ communities.
And will you have some text to recommend that we will be reading in advance?
I will. Yeah.
We'll post them on the Early Christian Text website then when Hal gives them to us. Very good then. All right. Well, we sure do want to thank you for this very lively and rich conversation on the violence in the letter of Peter to Philip. So this was the June 2021 Bible and Beyond Monday Textual Studies discussion on violence in the letter of Peter to Philip, led by Drs. Hal Taussig and Shirley Paulson. So once a month from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday nights, generally the 4th of the month, we provide a discussion of one of the early Christian texts. Dr. Hal Taussig usually leads these sessions, sharing a well-framed overview of the particular text and allowing participants to ask questions and share their insights. Donations supporting the creation of these textual study archives are greatly appreciated. You can now make an ongoing pledge of support via Patreon. So please go to patreon.com, Bible and Beyond, to make a pledge that's just right for you. You can also make a one-off donation using PayPal or a check if you prefer. Check the website, earlychristiantexts.com, for details. And we want to thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much.